Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center of Excellence for Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultations Conference, Equity from the Start. My name is Baraya, and I will serve as the session moderator for today. I am joined by Cynthia, who will serve as our technical host. So if you have any technical questions, you can direct them all towards Cynthia. The session is being recorded and transcription is available through the Zoom platform. And should you have any questions, please feel free to relay them into the chat. We will be taking questions during this session. So any questions for our presenters today, you can feel free to put them in the chat. That being said, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Hattie Harvey and Mr. Ethan Pettigrew, who will be conducting this workshop.
Thank you, Baraya. Anchorage, Alaska. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the session. My name is Ethan Pettigrew, and I'm one of the presenters for today. And I'd like to also introduce you to Dr. Hattie Harvey. Hattie, who will also be presenting. We wanted to start with the land recognition, and I know we're spread out over the entire continent, and we wanted to recognize that the fact that both Dr. Hattie and I live and work in the land of the Dena'ina Athabaskan people, who are the Southern Athabaskan for Alaska. I myself am Unangach from Aleutian region, so we wanted to give a land recognition. And so that's something you might want to think about, is recognizing the peoples whose land, indigenous peoples whose land you are upon. With that, I'll let Dr. Hattie go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for being here and joining our session today. We look forward to hearing from you and being able to share a little bit of our story here. So I will briefly go over our learning objectives today. We'd like to share with you a little bit of our context of our the Tribal Head Start program that we are representing today, and certainly thinking about this in the broader context to how it fits with your program and your professional position as well. The second one is briefly talk about some perspectives and thinking about that lens of historical trauma and injustices. We're talking about Alaska Native peoples, but again, more broadly, how this can also be related to many other indigenous peoples, and how this links to our infant early childhood mental health work. We'd like to share some considerations about how traditional practices really are the foundation of mental health service delivery, and that connection to infant mental health work, and particularly for a mental health consultant. And then certainly describe, as probably across all these sessions, that relationship building process is a central tenet to the work we do with all people, really. All right. Ethan, you want to share a little bit about the program? And you're on mute.
Sorry, I was trying to be respectful of you. Yeah, we're at Cook Inlet Native Head Start. It's the Tribal Head Start located in Anchorage, Alaska. We have two locations, one at Tudor and then one on 16th Street, a new one we just built. The new one, its traditional name is Naqayeht'ana, which is Dena'ina for our community place. So we started off, one of the issues for us as indigenous people in Anchorage, Alaska, is we feel very separated from people who are very similar to us, because we don't all live in one neighborhood. So it became an issue for indigenous people living here. The mission of our program, our Cook Inlet Native Head Start, is building strong foundations with Alaska Native families through our own Alaska Native cultures and education. And when I say education, we mean broadly Western education as well as indigenous ways of knowing, or education also. We serve 277 families and 194 Head Start children and 65 early Head Start, so birth to 3-year-olds, at 65 of those. The programming is center-based, full day and part day, home-based, immersion classroom, and there's a focus on culture across all aspects of our curriculum, our playgrounds, and now our building. Even our food program is based on indigenous food as much as possible, and as well as our physical activity. And then later you'll see a lot of our social program. Again, we're a program that's very concerned about the loss of indigenous culture, but more importantly for us is the children's lack of resilience, often what we see as a lack of resiliency when they're in public education, and dropout rate that our children have when they get in the upper grades. So we're very focused on building resiliency within our children, and the resiliency we see as our culture and our traditional connections, which have been erased in many cases by the boarding school systems.
I realized, jumping right in, I forgot to do our poll. So we wanted to see who is here with us today. So we're going backwards for a moment. So the first one that will come up is who is joining us today. Best fit description of your position.
So while your poll numbers are coming in, I'll just finish a little. Our program wanted to change what was happening with our children in later grades. And so we really saw with our kids in Anchorage a loss of culture, a loss of identity, not knowing who they are, even the case of not knowing what village their families come from. And so we felt strongly that our children need to be immersed in our culture as much as we can in Anchorage. And so that's really what our program has been focused on. And then how to indigenize an education system that is very, I don't want to say we didn't have education systems. We have our own traditional educational system, which we'll talk about later, for thousands of years, but a new system was put upon us in colonization. And so we've never really adapted to that. And that is where we want change happening, because our kids don't flourish in the system. And so part of that is where we focus this program is cultural relevancy in their education.
So it looks like we have a variety of folks, some consultants, some supervisors, systems leaders. Thank you. Give us a little sense of who's here with us today. And the other, if you have a chance to add into chat where you are located today, that also will give us a sense of who's here and where you reside. So we'll just watch that as we move on to our slides. Thank you. Okay.
So I'll go ahead and move on to context. We live in Anchorage, and unlike most of our regional areas or the village I come from, for instance, we have one tribe. Here in Anchorage, it is truly the land of the Naqayeht'ana, and they're the original people of here, but it has Anchorage's largest city and often referred to as the largest village, because we have all of us from all 21 different tribes have migrated into Anchorage, excuse me. And there are 21 different languages within our region, and then we have many different dialects. If we look at it broadly, we can categorize our Alaska Native people into 5 major culture groups. So for us, that became an area on how do we, because we represent and need to serve all Alaska Native children here, and we represent so many different ones, how are we going to do this? And so we started breaking it into, okay, the 5 major culture groups. We could teach it by that, but it still wasn't enough for us. And later on, you'll see where we developed different things to implement our frameworks, different things like that, and values, which help drive this. So there's 37,000 or almost 40,000 Alaska Natives living just in Anchorage alone. And of that, there's 4,200 birth to 5-year-olds that are not we're only serving 200 and some of those children. So there's a lot of our children who are not even being served between birth and 5 years old in Anchorage.
And I'll add, and certainly, no, we didn't catch this spelling mistake, right? The Alaska Native, not naive, certainly. And I want to add to the context, right? The geographical context when you think about service delivery and equity and access to, that only about 20% of Alaska communities are accessible by roads. And so when you think the other 80% are plane, boat, snow machine. And so that really exacerbates, our physical geography exacerbates that service delivery and what we think about and supporting access to, really. And so there's another session, I think tomorrow with Dr. Allen about thinking about that connection of mental health consultation across rural service delivery and how to enhance that through reflective supervision. That's just to
yeah,
add.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's so important. We live in Alaska's largest city, and it's a stretch to get mental health support in this community where you'd think things would be very accessible. But for instance, my home community is 1,200 miles away from here by airplane. I can't go by car, anything. And so it's really difficult getting mental health, any kind of mental health support in our villages that are spread throughout Alaska. So, and I think people need to realize there's oftentimes been a very big stereotype about us and our villages and that, oh, we still live pristine as we did 500 years ago. That is so wrong. We are afflicted with all kinds of issues from the beginning of colonization that we're still struggling with today. So we have terrible rates of all of the negative things that happen in society. So our villages are not untouched by contact and the negative things that come with that. So I just want people to realize that.
And I also am going to add here, I'm just a note, I see many missing T's on these slides. The slides that are uploaded to the website, those are all correct. So I apologize if you're seeing some spelling errors for my missing T on my my computer. So just a context without reading through these Alaska Native values, really, we wanted to share this because it really transcends across the work. And as infant mental health consultant, for me coming in, and I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, I am the consultant for this program, the recognition and critical aspect of understanding and really recognizing that foundation of values that transcends all the work. And then how does that help inform me as a consultant in being able to support children and families across this program?
And with this, when I talked about how are we going to teach this, the 5 major culture groups, and then this is what really drove us, is because we realized that between all 21 different tribes, we have 10 common values. And this was through the University of Alaska, did probably 20 years ago. They brought elders and culture bearers from all different regions and villages together to talk about and to identify what our traditional values were. And when they gathered the second time, they screened through these and they all agreed with these 10 basic values. And so at that point, we knew that our value system has not changed since before contact, and that these were the 10 values that we would try to thread throughout our entire program in all parts of it. And even with our teaching with staff, even our interactions with each other, we expect people to follow these values so that our kids are seeing it and living it.
And this is where kind of that framework, when we say those Alaska Native values are the equity framework, this whole conference is really focused on building equity. And so recognizing that this, again, transcends across that mission, vision, all, we're not going to go into details of what the environment, curriculum, family engagement, staff development are in this setting, but that these are all critical components, right, of any high quality early childhood program. And then it's the values that really are integrated very intentionally and explicitly. So I added this down here where you see equity is not a component of, but rather an add-on, or not an add-on, rather it's a central embedded foundation of which all aspects of programming are built upon. So I wanted to call this out in thinking about how this links to the diversity informed tenets of infant early childhood mental health practice. and I'm not sure how many people are familiar or not with those. I do have those on a later slide. So as we kind of continue through this presentation, this is really just a reflective question. Right. So just a few examples, and then, you know, again, thinking about this information around the Alaska Native values or whatever program you're in and how that transcends and informs the work. And again, as a mental health consultant, I needed to know and immerse myself in the program. You know, I think one of the challenges in many ways is this this lens of what constitutes mental health service delivery. And I know many programs may have a contracted consultant and are required to have that billable hour. So, you know, that question of, well, how does one ensure that they're participating, being part of that curriculum, being part of that family engagement? It's not a direct service, but yet it's really critical to that, the foundation of supporting healthy mental health.
And for us, that family engagement is a huge part of our program. And we noticed that in the past, when we tried to do family engagement, when we ran a very westernized program, there was a very big disconnect with our families, and that we couldn't get them to come to these events. It were not the ones you see on the screen, but events that were based on budgeting or healthy eating, which are all great topics, and our families need to know about those, but they weren't drawing people. When we were working on curriculum, and our Alaska Native values drive our curriculum, and so does our subsistence cycles, because these are still something, even though many of us are urbanized natives, we still plug into our traditional hunting and gathering. So for instance, many of us will leave the city in the summer and go to our fish camps. We still are very tied to that system, and our villages even more so than we are. And so that became a very big part of our curriculum. And so when we thought about our family engagements as well, we said, let's change these up. Let's focus on these activities instead. And then also the food would be, for instance, from that month, if it was a Yupik month, we would be celebrating with Yupik food and celebration with dancing and storytellers. We went from about 12 people engaged in these to before COVID hit, over 500 people coming to these events. And so I think part of this is, as indigenous people too, we have never maybe through colonization, we've been taught that our traditional ways of doing things are not appropriate. And therefore I'm 62 and I've, you know, master's degree in education, and it took me years and years to understand that, geez, some of the traditional activities that my people do are actually positive mental health support systems, where we've been taught that those are bad and wrong. So I'll end with there. Dr. Hattie.
Thank you for saying that and making that connection. Both Ethan and I have had many conversation around just that term mental health, right, which is really a westernized term, and what that means. And then again, supporting that connection with families. They still, as probably many of you here, struggle with that terminology of mental health, and really being able to start to honor and recognizing those traditional practices and non-dominant bodies of ways of being, ways of seeing that are supporting mental health. And so I think it's really critical that we can continue to have conversations to kind of dismantle that terminology as a negative connotation. So in this next little section, really recognize and honor the dearth of the topic here, but wanted to share some stories around understanding the connection between intergenerational effects of historical trauma. We know this isn't a presentation on this per se, but we know there's a lot of recognition and research on that impact, you know, the epigenetic impact on stress responses, on parenting. And so again, as we connect and think about infant early childhood mental health work, that it's not just in the day-to-day present, that we have to think about this as a kind of a longer, more broadly, because it does inform supporting those relationships, developing those relationships, and honoring the past influences and where individuals, programs, cultures, and groups of people are. So, Ethan.
And I thank you, Dr. Addy. I think this is, we don't want to spend a whole time on this history and boarding school and effects, because it's definitely a huge topic and we go into years of discussion on this, but it does affect us as indigenous people. And I think the Western world needs to understand what they're dealing with, basically, what you're working with. And I have some examples coming up here, but we're not pristine villages up here that have never been touched by outside society. We've been in contact with the Western world for quite a while, actually, and started in the 1700s up here. We were at one point literate in our own language and Russian. That was in 1867. And then in 1867, Americanization took place. And at that point, our language was banned as well as Russian was banned. And so we were then struggling to fight and keep our languages. So we've been interacting with education for a long time, Western education, even since it's been here. We were the first ones even to challenge the Supreme Court, Rudolph Walton, the Davis versus Sitka case, and getting his children to go to white school rather than Indian school. So we've been involved in I would call it a fight to equity in education as well as other parts of our lives for quite a while. But I want people to understand the effect, because I think the greatest detriment to our families you're dealing with today, the biggest, although historical trauma has taken place for us for 500 years, the biggest thing I think we're dealing with today is the effects of the boarding school. And you think, well, that's pretty historical. And yeah, it is somewhat historical, but for my generation, we lived in it. For instance, I graduated in 1978. People probably don't realize that in 1978, it was a great year for us, actually, as Native people. In 1978, we were legally able to practice our own religion at that time, finally. But the other real important thing is that at 1978, it became, because of Indian child welfare, it became illegal for them to legally sterilize girls in boarding school. So if people think that this stuff has not caused trauma, we need to rethink this. I went to school with kids who never got to go home to their village for 12 years because it was too isolated and they couldn't get them in and out easy enough. So these children lost their whole language, they lost their whole identity, basically. So boarding school has had huge impacts on us. Up here, children were taken out of the village every year for at least 9 months. So you would go up until the 80s. You would go into the villages here during wintertime, there would be no children. And so in these educational systems, is where the most damage took place. And so we have children being raised in institutions who are now grandparents even, and going back and raising their own children and then becoming grandparents who don't know how to raise children in a traditional Native sense, let alone a Western white sense. It's really a boarding school parent is what they are. And so terribly damaged children that became adults that are now passing this cycle on of just terrible things that happen in our families. And so the question is, was it really educating our people, or was it really genocide, cultural genocide for us, the system that you're dealing with? And so Native people have not done well at traditionally interacting even with educators, the Western education system. And so I think that this is really important for folks to understand that this boarding school system has had a huge effect on us. And Dr. Hattie, I think you wanted to, before we go into the house that fell, have something to say in here. No? Good.
Well, and I see in the chat, thank you for putting in a link to healing. We also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of resources and supports and work happening in that healing process. So thank you, Alan Gutman, for putting that in. I wanted to, this next little part is a story, and I wanted Ethan to be able to share this, because as I was first started my work as a mental health consultant with this program, Ethan shared this story with me, and it was so powerful in, again, kind of grounding, bringing me back and grounding me to really the sense and the purpose, right? The purpose of relationships, the purpose of being part of community, and how important community is. And I'm going to keep saying that I call on consultants specifically to think about their time with people, their time in the programs, and that community, being part of that community, part of that relationship building and trust process as the most important part of the work. So I'm going to let Ethan, you share, and we'll hope that all of our all of our little transitions work in this section.
Thanks, Dr. Hattie. So this next this little thing is presentations on the house that fell, and it's a I use our Tlingit clan houses. We've belonged to our mother's house, our mother's side house in our clan, in our culture. And this here is a bear house, but I use this traditional house structure as a symbol of what the story I'm going to tell. And it's in effect what's happened to indigenous people. And it's what you're dealing with, whether you're talking to an indigenous child, a whole family, a whole community, in many cases, our whole nation of indigenous groups. We are all touched by colonization. It's definitely a model you can use. This model applies to many different groups of people who've been colonized by another group. And I want to say it's not just a phenomenon that happened in North America for us, colonization. This has happened to the Ainu people of Japan, for instance. It's happened all over the world with different groups. But this is, I think, what we're dealing with today when we're working with children and families who seem broken. And when our traditional people, we had very strong societies, and when things were taken away from us, what has happened? What happened to us? Because we talk about a time when our ancestors, 3-4 generations ago, when our society was intact, we had no child abuse. We had people didn't murder amongst our own people. If there did, there was terrible retribution by clans. It was a time when there was great order, and we talk about our families being very healthy. Now we look at our families and they're just broken, and they're riddled with alcoholism, and there's other sexual abuse going on, physical abuse. What's happened to us as a people? And I think many of our own people don't even realize this. But go ahead, Dr. Hattie. We find our strengths as indigenous people in the way we introduce ourselves. In my language, I just told you, I gave you, in my traditional system, I just gave you my support systems, the people, the systems that I fall back on when I need support, or when I'm not feeling healthy, or when enemies are on my shoulders, anything in the world, and in our culture, we have this thing the Yupik people call sangwak, which is the balance of the universe. And so if I'm out of balance, this is who I go to. This is my strength. This is who I find myself in. But colonization took place, and you remember what our traditional houses looked like. After a period of time, we start copying the houses of the white men, and we start becoming more and more colonized. And with this colonization, we start losing control of ourselves, of our resources, of who we are. And we actually fall into a state of dilapidation, I want to say. We're so influenced by Westerners at this point, we think that our chief of our village has to live in a white house. So we paint his house white, where we've lost that essence of that beautiful traditional sense of who we are. We're now trying to be somebody else. And so let me show you in a very stick form figure of how this works, because this is, I know our traditional houses probably look very strange to people. When our people first came here, there was, of course, the land and the ocean. And with that, there were the resources. Those were what our people first found when we were either created in this land or, as some of our traditional stories tell us, migrated under the glaciers to this land. And so when we came here, we formed social structures within our society, and these social structures and the control of the resources allow us eventually to form, we have an economic base, we have traditions that are being formed. With those traditions, we have spirituality that transcends and is found through all parts of our society at this point. We have our own education system even, and this education system was thousands of years old. Our boys at the age of 7 were given to the maternal uncle who was in charge of training them. The girls, after their first menses, were sent to the maternal uncle's house where his wife or wives were in charge of teaching her all the skills of being a woman. And so we had an education system in place. It didn't look like the Western system, but it was definitely an education system. And it was a system, I got to say, that we survived on for 12,000 years. And it worked well for us. But then the Western system came and tells us eventually it's not good. With that, we create our own governance. We have traditional systems of our governance. And then I just have to add a totem pole on the outside here, which is, I think our language is next. Yep. So our language is in all parts of a society, and it's truly a very rich language. We're at a state of making, when new things come, we create our own words out of our own language base. You see that changes later during contact. But the other part of this is we have arts in all part of our society. It's not something that sits on the doctor's wall or the dentist's wall. This is now artwork that we're wearing, we're dancing in, we're eating. It's in all, even our utilitarian things have our traditional arts. And our health at that point was excellent. And in some of our regions, we have mummies that are 100 years old and that were healthy. And then after World War II, many of our people didn't live past 30. So with this, your house is strong. You've got a great house. And with that, you have prestige because your neighbors are looking at you like, wow, you guys have it all together. And so there's lots of sunshine happening here. Lots of bright things. Go ahead, Dr. Hattie. There's a bunch of them on there. Your values are intact and you have a sense of we and great pride. And your morals are all kept in place. For instance, in my traditional society, child abuse was death penalty was it by stick strangling. And so not to say those things never happened. It was rare according to our traditional stories for those things. Today, we're riddled with a lot of these problems. And so this is what our house looks like. This is what our village looks like. It's what my nation looks like when I am in control of all of these things. But over a period of time, colonization took place. We lost our resources, our social structure, everything starts to fall apart. When that happens, this now is what our house looks like. And when a child is in this house or a community, you think they're looking up and you think everybody else is looking, your neighbors are looking and going, oh, look at the Smith's house over there. It's not looking so good. So you start losing things up there in your sunshine. And what happens is, first of all, as Native people, we feel shame. I grew up with kids who were so ashamed of being Native. One of them, she was Hawaiian, if anybody outsiders asked, because she thought Hawaiians, it was romantic sounding and sounded like they had it better off than us, not realizing or understanding their process of colonization was identical. The other part is that another boy would try to pass himself off as Black Irish. Many of my friends wanted to be anything but Native because we came from houses like this. One house might have more language, one house might have better health, one might do more artwork, but our houses are in shambles. And with that comes guilt for being Native. It's my fault, it's our fault. Geez, everything we do is dumb, it's stupid, there's nothing of value anymore. And pretty soon I start internalizing that to myself. Oh, my people. In fact, I've worked with a lot of high school kids in the past. One high school boy, it still brings tears to my ears and my heart. I hate being Native, he said. And I asked why? Because it means we're drunk and we're beating our wives all the time. That's a terribly distorted sense of what being Native is. That's the effect of colonization and all this low self-esteem. And then finally, all of these negative behaviors that start taking place. We have the highest suicide rate for our children. We have the highest everything, self-destructive behavior. Murders is just terrible as indigenous people. And even in our tiniest villages, these things exist. And so what you're dealing with are children from homes like that and families with those homes. What we need is help to revitalize our homes, our culture. We need from schools, we need mental health consultants to be working with us in bringing our people to the sense that what we had in traditional times was strong and healthy for us. And it's okay for us to do that. And in addition to Western practices, there's nothing wrong with both. We should feel comfortable walking with both feet in both of these worlds. We shouldn't have to feel that our traditional things are such a deficit. And again, when I was at a mental health conference and it was pointed out to me that I've always been a traditional dance group, I lead a traditional dance group today, that's actually mental health and a positive support for that. I could not believe it. It was amazing to me. It was just a revelation. So what we're asking is for people to help us rebuild these homes so that our people look like this final slide. We call Naqayeht'ana, which means this is the dogfish house, also later named the bear house. And it belongs to the Naqayeht, the people from up the river Nanya. And they're but we're asking that, we know that we can't do this ourselves, and it was the huge process of the Western education system that helped to deteriorate and take these things from us. We want these things built back into our systems so our kids are resilient and strong, and so our families also feel a part of this. And so we're asking for these systems to work with us and find ways to navigate this and to incorporate our way of being. So Dr. Hattie.
It was a lot of information that I'm thinking about how this might reflect, how you might reflect on this story. So one of our, we're looking at our time and coming up closer to our end. So just a few minutes and reflecting on this story of the house that fell, how it might inform or connect to the work you do, whether it's personally, professionally, in your role as a system. And so I think we're just going to do like a short, like 3-minute breakout group. So you have an opportunity to connect with others in this session. So let's go ahead and do some quick breakout groups, and then we'll come back in and wrap up. You want to go ahead and close the breakout rooms, Cynthia? Okay, it looks like most folks are back. Here we go. All right, thanks for taking a few minutes. I know, never know with these sessions with breakout rooms, not everyone's always available. So thank you for participating if you were able to. So as we come back together, I just wanted to really acknowledge and bring back kind of full circle to the diversity informed tenets for work with infants, children, and families, many of which link certainly to this work across programs, right? That self-awareness leads to better service for families. We're working, acknowledging non-dominant bodies of knowledge, honoring diverse family structures. These really, as you can hear in Ethan's story, some of that foundation and prevalence of the work to rebuild, honor, value different worldviews, different bodies of knowledge, different perspectives. And we know that that first component of that really takes that self-reflection and intentional time for increasing our own awareness. I added the cultural humility. I often go back to this in thinking about the role, the definition of cultural humility is really that lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby we not only learn about others, but it really starts with examination of ourselves. So in our last few minutes, just wanted to share a few, I know Ethan wanted to share as well some practices in this setting of mental health. And again, as for myself in a role as the mental health consultant and working on supporting this as a program-wide system. And we're integrating the pyramid model, and how this fits into the pyramid model as well is really honoring those traditional practices as that foundation of curriculum and the supports across the system.
And yeah, thank you. I think, and again, I just can't go say enough about how much I'm just amazed that, and even in the group I was in across the world, somewhere in South Africa, they make the same connection that our indigenous traditional ways of doing things are healthy and good for us, but we've been taught that they're bad. I mean, I'm still dealing with indigenous families who refuse to use native language with their children, even though the parents speak it, because they think it's bad for our kids. We've been taught these things. And so this is an example of healthy activities that we do here, I think, that support our mental health. This is little children dancing. I don't know if this has a video with it or not, Dr. Hattie. The other.
No video.
Okay, the other activities we've done fatherhood initiatives where we have the fathers come in with children and making drums, etc. We've done beading and kuspak making. Those are traditional clothing items. I guess just the point is that even beyond dancing, there's many of our traditional activities which we have been taught to keep out of our school systems are actually positive for us. And I don't know what that does, and maybe you folks can tell me what that does to a group of people when you deprive them. I mean, I can tell you what the effects are, but I don't know what the scientific or medical reasoning is. When you force to deprive them of who they are, it's just done terrible things to us. So with that, I think we need to go into a Q&A. Dr. Hattie, is that correct?
Yeah, and our concluding thoughts and slides, again, is reiterating that knowledge, honoring belief systems, all belief systems, engaging in that self-reflection in whatever role you are in, whether it's that direct service or more programmatic level, systems level work. and focus on connection. You know, one thing that I, again, really want to encourage those of you as mental health consultants or those who are supervisors or in the systems work, and how we ensure that relationship building, connection to community is part of the work. That's not a new idea, right? Certainly we all recognize that. When we think about billable hours or how we're engaging in conversations with maybe programs who expect a certain what the mental health consultant role might be, engaging in those conversations of how critical that relationship building and time process is. Relationships with families and teachers is the foundation for all the work we do, because we know that's really going to enhance the system, the program, enhancing all, building up that healthy mental health across families, staff, etc.
Yeah, once again, and building that strong family understanding. And I think the biggest reward for me was seeing a grandmother aged person come to me and tap me on the shoulder when we built our cultural playground. She had tears in her eyes and her grandchildren were playing on the sod house. Obviously somebody who'd been hurt by the traumatic, historical, probably boarding schools, said to me, "Are you the one responsible for this?" And I said, "No." I said, "Many of us were in on this. Why?" And she goes, in tears were flowing down her cheeks, "I never thought I would see the day where it was okay for my children to be Native." And so with that, I think that we're open up to comments and questions.
So there's no questions in the chat, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We have a couple more minutes.
And feel free to reach out to either of us in our contact as well.
Lots of positive feedback.
Thank you for listening and being here today.
Yes, Karasa Chusakuk, thank you very much. I was looking, well, we really have people from all over the world on here. This is great.
Thank you for the feedback and comments. And I understand if people have to hop off for their next session or next, I don't know, time. We're only at a lunchtime here in Alaska, so we're at lunch next.
Hi there, this is Annie Davis. I just wanted to note that maybe you didn't get some questions. I wasn't able to unmute myself, and I don't know if perhaps others weren't as well. So just wanted to share that. And I don't actually so much have a question as a comment, that I wonder if there will be kind of another version of the house one day that incorporates kind of those pillars of like kind of rebuilding or healing, like if there's like a next part to the story there. Because I think your comments, the way that you framed it, I was almost kind of visualizing that like a rebuilding, not into this maybe the same, but into a new and powerful visual. So because I can see in the chat, and I heard in my small group that was very it just so resonant with folks to see it depicted visually that way.
Thank you.
Alrighty, and we have reached time. So thank you everyone for joining this session. Thank you to our presenters for an amazing presentation. The recordings and the material will be available on the CVent website or the Center of Excellence website in about 2 weeks' time. Thank you.